Having spoken extensively about the war on land and also the conflict in the air in Ukraine, I thought it was finally time to turn my attention to the war at sea. Because as much as Russia enjoyed a material superiority both on land and in the air at the start of the conflict, at sea the gap between Russian capabilities and the Ukrainians was its most dramatic. On paper, the Black Sea Fleet was essentially the lord of all it surveyed, master of the Black Sea. And it would begin the war accordingly, launching missile strikes ranging up and down the Ukrainian coast, choking off Ukrainian access to foreign maritime supply, and threatening naval landings near the city of Odessa. But on 14 April, all that would change. The Russian flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, the Moskva, would be sunk, and from that time onwards the Black Sea Fleet has largely been conservative, spending much of its time sheltering behind Crimea and staying away from the Ukrainian coastline. And you can bet that every country that thinks its warships might have to operate in a literal environment in the future will be looking at this situation and wondering how and why. Why would a force with such massive paper superiority be forced to retreat from the opposing coastline? And what does it mean that a relatively small complement of anti-ship missiles and drones has been able to essentially deny large swaths of the Black Sea to the Russian Navy? Alright, so what am I going to be covering today? Firstly, I'm going to look at the evolution of the Russian Navy because I think it puts a lot of what we have seen in context. Secondly, I want to frame what sort of ships, what portion of the Russian Navy was available to deploy in the Black Sea against Ukraine. As part of that, we're going to look at Russian ship design and the strengths and weaknesses that tend to go along with it. Then I'm going to look at how the campaign has evolved, starting with the early war, the missile strikes, the threatened maritime landings, working through the sinking of the Moskva and the war since then. Finally then, I'm going to try and address critical questions, namely, what next for the war in the Black Sea, and also what lessons and observations can foreign observers and actors take away from what we have seen of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict in the Black Sea since the beginning of the war. Because as you can imagine, there have been quite a few takes on that particular question, some I would suggest more valid than others. So to start with, I think it's important to understand the evolution of the Russian Navy. How did it become the force it is today? Because if you don't have that understanding, it's very hard to take lessons out of what's happened. And I'd argue this is even more important in the case of a navy than, for example, say, an army. Because in an emergency, most nations can raise an army relatively quickly. If you've got a decent enough population that knows how to do such complicated things as walk long distances, operate a firearm after basic training, and listen to instructions, then you're most of the way there to at least putting together a basic infantry corps. Naval strategy, by contrast, is built strategy. It needs to be built up over many, many years. You can't just put together ships, shipyards, and sailors overnight. When it comes to blue water operations, swimming is not a viable alternative, and so the industrial and human capital base needs to be in place for you to accomplish any given goal. The industrial and social requirements that go into building a functional navy means that if you look at the global stage, there is a greater difference between the naval powers and the non-naval powers as compared to, say, the difference between everyone's army strength. If you happen to be, for example, a large continent-sized island nation in the southern hemisphere, whose only real border is with some particularly interesting sea life, well, you're probably going to put emphasis on building a navy above just about everything else. I mean, nations like the United States at least have to be worried that, say, for example, the Canadians might decide they want to burn the White House a second time. By contrast, a country like Switzerland or Hungary doesn't have much need for a navy, although in Hungary's case, that didn't stop an admiral from running the country for some years. Russia doesn't fit cleanly into either of these categories, but historically it's been more a land power than a naval one. It's always had naval and overseas interests, but in terms of critical threats to its existence, they've usually been land-based. Tally up the list of people who have made it to Moscow and sacked it, the Mongols, the Poles, Napoleon, they tend to come by land. This has given rise to the Russian obsession with the idea of strategic depth and creating a buffer along their western border. But it also means that the emphasis placed on naval power in Russia has waxed and waned depending on who is in power at the time. In the Russian Empire, the strength of the navy mapped to how interested the Tsar happened to be in naval affairs. Peter the Great, for example, was obsessed with making Russia a naval power, and so Russia built a fleet. Other Tsars were less interested, and as a result, the fleet suffered. The Russian Empire would have its fair share of naval victories and successes against opponents like the Swedes and the Turks, but it would also have the 2nd Pacific Squadron and the Battle of Tsushima, a spotty record altogether. After the rise of the Soviet Union, Stalin wanted a grand blue water navy, complete with battleships that would have tested the Soviet Union's industrial capabilities to its absolute limits. But the German invasion and post-war economic realities would ultimately scupper those grand plans. The Soviets would end the Second World War as a second-rate naval power, lagging behind both the United States Navy, which by now was essentially unchallenged in quantity and quality, but also still the Royal Navy. Victorious at the end of the Second World War, the Royal Navy would ultimately be defeated by every navy's greatest opponent, the Treasury, and its strength would drop as the British Empire receded. But the Soviet Navy was still greatly outmatched by the United States Navy alone, let alone the combined naval power of all of the NATO allies. And so the Soviet Union spends the early Cold War era thinking like an asymmetric opponent, focusing on small vessels, naval aviation, submarines, ships encounters like that in order to counter the overwhelming NATO naval advantage. The focus instead is on strategic nuclear deterrence and building an army capable of fighting and potentially winning an atomic war in Europe. You don't need to worry about the Battle of the Atlantic too much if your plan is to go to the River Rhine in 7 days. From a budgeting and strategic perspective, you could argue this sort of naval austerity and approach made sense. But it is an approach that would ultimately be thrown out with the rise of one man in particular, Admiral Sergei Gorshkov. Gorshkov wanted more than a coastal defense navy. He wanted more than submarines that could harass NATO naval power. He wanted a true blue water force that was capable of going toe-to-toe with its US opponent on the high seas. For a country with a less established naval industrial base than the United States, with much less of a naval history and recent combat record, it seemed like an incredible ask. But for all its faults, the Soviet Union was occasionally capable of accomplishing incredible things when it set its sights on a particular objective. The NATO forces had to watch as the Russian Navy embarked on a tremendous peacetime naval buildup. They introduced new generations of anti-ship missiles capable of destroying US carriers at very long range. New generations of submarines came online, and the Soviets looked seriously again at the idea of carrier aviation. And this wasn't a mirror image of the NATO fleets that the Soviets were building. It wasn't built according to US or British design philosophy. Instead, the design ideas of the ships in question were uniquely Soviet, intended to counter their NATO opponents. And the legacy of those design choices is as important today as when they were first made in the 70s and 80s. Now, I am massively oversimplifying here because I cannot go through every ship type that the Soviets built, but here's a basic top-level breakdown. If you look at US ship design, surface ship design for example, a lot of the combat ships have a very clear mission: keep the carrier alive. The assumption is that the carrier aircraft are going to ruin everyone else's day, so the rest of the fleet is mostly there to provide intelligence and defense cover for the carrier. So you see very heavy anti-aircraft armaments, and then also concessions to things like livability. Soviet ships, by contrast, tend to prioritize one element above all: firepower. Unless it's a dedicated anti-submarine warfare vessel, the ships of the Russian Navy pack an incredible array of anti-ship firepower. To illustrate, let's consider, for example, the Moskva. The Moskva was launched originally as Slava and was one of the Slava-class cruisers. To defend against air and missile threats, because you might face a few of those if you go up against the USN, there were 64 S-300 long-range anti-aircraft missiles and 40 short-range missiles. In the event that a missile got through, there were 6 30mm rotary cannons that were capable of throwing out a veritable wall of lead at any missile that got through. And then there was the offensive systems designed to sink enemy warships. Here, the Moskva mounted 16 P-500 or more recently P-1000 launchers, P-500 being known by its famous NATO reporting name, the Sandbox. The sandboxes are the things occupying those giant tubes you see cluttering the Moskva's deck. This is a missile weighing almost 5 tons that's capable of doing 3 times the speed of sound and reaching out and touching an enemy ship at a range of more than 500 kilometers, delivering a 1-ton warhead. Despite being an older weapon system, when I talk to people in the US Navy or to other allied forces, weapons like the Sandbox still worry them, because it's a very fast-moving object, launched in numbers from a very long distance, with enough destructive power that if even 1 or 2 gets through, well then even the largest ship is going to really feel the impact. To compare and contrast, an American Ticonderoga-class cruiser might only mount 8 Harpoon missiles as its anti-ship armament. The entire Harpoon missile weighs less than the warhead on the Sandbox. The weapon system has a fraction of the range, and it's subsonic, meaning a defending ship has a lot more time to handle an interception than it would against something that's travelling 3 times the speed of sound. The basic gist here is the Soviets found a way to fit an awful lot of boom onto each hull that they put into the water. and in so doing hoped that they had the weapon systems necessary to win some long-range exchanges even if they were outnumbered by their US opponents. But from a design perspective, there are costs associated with such a single-minded focus on firepower. Not least of which because if you're going to stick missile systems everywhere, you're not going to have as much internal or external volume for, anything else. To speak again in very general terms, Soviet warships were sometimes harder to maintain and live on than their Western competitors. Some critical components were sometimes harder to access and service, living conditions were sometimes lower. Plus, it turns out there are damage control implications for putting 16 tons of high explosive and a whole bunch of jet fuel on the deck, and that's just counting the long-range anti-ship missiles, not counting anything stored below decks. There is a reason sailors in many navies have to deal with crushingly common, boring, repetitive exercises around dealing with the threat of ammunition flash. Namely because whether in combat or out of it, a ship's own ammunition is one of the primary threats to it. Just ask the battle cruisers at the Battle of Jutland. But I want to stress again, these weaknesses don't exist because Russian designers and Soviet design teams were stupid. They weren't. They wanted to build ships with enough weapon systems to counter the larger NATO navies and potentially kill US carriers. For the most part, the design concessions that followed were just a result of engineers meeting the design brief. They managed to fit 16 12-metre long missiles on a ship that only had a length of 186 metres. That's an achievement. But all of this would rot away, or more accurately rust away during the 1990s. I'm aware that I must sound like a broken record because I bring the 90s back into just about every discussion of current Russian military strength, and people will be like, geez Perun, it was 30 years ago. But in response, I would humbly suggest that it's very difficult to understand Russian society, the Russian state, or the Russian military without understanding how deeply traumatic the 1990s were to the state and also to the military-industrial complex and the armed forces themselves. Suddenly, overnight, the Soviet Navy was shattered. A number of its warships were now stationed in foreign areas. Half of its supply chain was in foreign countries. Ukraine, for example, was absolutely critical in order to keeping the Soviet Navy working. Moskva was launched in the Mykolaiv shipyards in Ukraine. Overnight, the budgets for the Navy evaporated. Corruption, which was already existent under the Soviet Union, became rampant. You got to the point where sailors weren't being paid, were taking side jobs just in order to be able to afford food to survive, where bases were being shaken down by members of the mafia. Gorshkov and Brezhnev had built a navy which gave the United States a serious opponent, and then in the 90s, it all fell apart. When you're talking about ship designs that are optimized for performance and firepower above all, not for ease of maintenance or sustainability, then those years of neglect were especially harmful. The Russian Navy would be a major beneficiary of the military buildup that Vladimir Putin would oversee. Budgets would be increased, the defense industrial base would be rebuilt, connections with countries like Ukraine re-established, and the Russian Navy steadily put back into a position of apparent capability. Many observers also noted an apparent modernisation. There were new classes of warship and new modernisations of old ones. There was a movement towards a greater introduction of systems like the Kalibr cruise missile and putting VLS cells on anything with spare deck space. VLS cells, by the way, are vertical launch systems. They're basically tubes that carry missiles vertically so you can fit more in a given area of deck space. So you can take something like the Kalibr, stick a pattern of cells on a small warship, and all of a sudden you have a ship which is capable of delivering very long-range precision fires. NATO navies love VLS systems, and the Chinese absolutely adore them. In recent years, the Russian Navy had matured to the point where it was capable of some expeditionary operations. It went to Syria, for example, sustained a force in operation over there. It was able to logistically maintain it, and it was able to demonstrate that it could fire cruise missiles using naval ships from long distances, and sometimes strike targets accurately, and sometimes miss. But it's important to stress that the rebuilding, the modernisation process was incomplete and also difficult to critique in detail. You still had situations of major warships with terrible reliability and maintenance and upkeep issues. Russia's aircraft carrier is reputed to be so unreliable that it needs to be followed by a tug everywhere it goes in case it breaks down and needs to be dragged back to port. But overall, it did seem like some of the damage done during the 1990s had been steadily repaired. The Russian fleet was expanding its capabilities and even discussing the possibility of building a new generation aircraft carrier. According to Military Balance, in 2021, the full strength of the Russian Navy was as follows: And remember, I use the MB 2021 figures even when they're not perfect because it gives consistent values across my various videos. According to the MB 2021 designation system, Russia had 31 principal surface combatants. Think of these as the big combat warships, including 1 carrier, 4 heavy guided missile cruisers, and 11 guided missile destroyers. Arguably the most dangerous arm of the service was actually the submarines, with 11 ballistic missile submarines, 7 nuclear-guided missile submarines, 10 nuclear hunter-killer submarines, and 21 diesel-electric submarines. And of those, the boomers, the 11 ballistic missile submarines, arguably being the most important because they're the bedrock of Russia's strategic deterrence capability. All this was rounded out by 125 so-called patrol and coastal combatants. These are patrol boats, minesweepers, very small vessels, usually with quite light armaments that are designed to operate close to the coast. To assist and to provide reference throughout the rest of this presentation, what I've included here is a recognition guide for surface combatants of the Russian Federation Navy put out by the US. I may remember to link a version of this chart in high definition in the description. It doesn't include every class of combat warship in the Russian Navy, but it is useful for translating if I name a particular class or an individual vessel to identify its size and its rough silhouette and capabilities. So that's a bit of history on how the Russian Navy became what it is today. Now we need to talk about the war in Ukraine and the Russian Navy's role in it. And the key but obvious point of context to add here before we jump into it is that not all of the Russian Navy is engaged in the Ukraine war. Most of the fighting is being done by the Black Sea Fleet. Russia has a Baltic fleet, it's got a Pacific fleet, it's got the Northern fleet, but Ukraine doesn't border the Pacific or the Baltic, and as a result, most of the combat strength engaged against it are the large warships that were stationed in the Black Sea when the war began. In 2021, that meant 6 diesel-electric submarines and 6 principal surface combatants. The flagship of the fleet was obviously the Moskva, a Slava-class cruiser. There were 3 heavy guided missile frigates of the Admiral Grigorovich class, and there were 2 Krivak-class ships, plus a whole collection of patrol and coastal combatants, 35 in all. It's worth noting that some of these ships were some of the most modern in the Russian Navy. In particular, the Admiral Grigorovich class were pretty new. 2016 was the commission date for the ships in question, I believe. But the ability of the Russians to reinforce this fleet after the war began is actually limited. Turkey has power over the Dardanelles Straits by virtue of the 1936 Montreux Convention, and on the 28th of February, relatively shortly after the war began, Turkey closed the straits to any warship that hadn't already been based in the Black Sea, and pretty soon after it closed those lines, it specifically denied Russia permission to enter a number of additional warships that had been in the Mediterranean into the Black Sea. Now, Russia can transfer some smaller vessels from its other fleets to the Black Sea using its own internal network of rivers and canals, but the larger warships are basically stuck. You're not going to get Pyotr Veliki or Admiral Kuznetsov traveling down the Volga. It's just not going to happen. It would be small vessels only in terms of reinforcements. And to put this into perspective, here's the recognition guide I put up before, but here I've used red boxes to designate those ships which sources suggest were in the Black Sea Fleet at the time that the war began. It's certainly not nothing, but especially in terms of those larger combatants, it's a relatively small proportion of what Russia had available to it. Read what you will into that particular deployment choice. But even if this was a small proportion of Russia's overall naval strength, the Russian Navy's role in the opening salvos of the invasion of Ukraine on 24 February were notable. Now, obviously, it's incredibly hard to determine what proportion of the notable hits that occurred in the early stages of the war by cruise missile attack should be credited to the Black Sea Fleet. But the fact that it played a role in these missile strikes shouldn't have been a surprise. This was exactly what the Russian Navy had been practicing in Syria for some years. With the missiles in the air, the rumour mill also churned over what else the Russian Navy might contribute. The biggest point of discussion was a potential amphibious landing by Russian naval infantry, probably to threaten the port of Odessa. Even at the earliest juncture, many commentators were saying such a move probably wouldn't make sense when compared to an overland movement from Crimea through Mykolaiv to Odessa, but that didn't really matter. The apprehension was real. Occasionally people will comment on my videos suggesting certain pro-Russian English-speaking commentators as a more credible source of information on the war. Now, I try not to engage with those sort of things, they're not particularly productive, but I will note that at this stage of the war, a number of these commentators were suggesting either that a naval landing had already taken place, it hadn't, or that a naval landing was imminent and would take Odessa, again. It wasn't and it didn't. But just the threat of a potential landing kept Ukrainian forces stationed in Odessa and led to the local authorities drafting in civilians to build defences against a potential amphibious invasion. It was a prudent step and diverted Ukrainian forces, even if the threat was more imagined than real. Mostly because, if anyone needs a reminder out there, opposed amphibious landings are really, really hard. Beaches aren't exactly known for their supply of cover, and it's sort of difficult to compete with an opponent that might have tanks and artillery in position when you're just landing the initial waves of light infantry. But while the amphibious landing wasn't to be, the threat to the Ukrainian Navy was very, very real, and not the finest moment of Ukraine during the early stages of the war. There is sometimes a tendency I've noticed among commentators to basically suggest the Ukrainians can do no wrong and suffer no defeats, and that the Russians are a bunch of incompetents. The story of the Ukrainian Navy is counter to that particular narrative. While you'll often now hear that Ukraine doesn't even have a navy and Russia is still somehow scared of it, two quick points to make there. Firstly, the Russian Navy probably isn't scared of the Ukrainian Navy. It's scared of ground-based anti-ship missiles, which is a threat which makes just about any surface navy out there a little bit nervous. And the second point is Ukraine had a navy before the war began. Not a particularly large one, but it existed. Relatively soon after the war began, it didn't. The largest vessel of the Ukrainian Navy, the Hetman Sahaydachny, would be scuttled 3 days after the war began, ostensibly to prevent her capture. Notably, she was scuttled in Mykolaiv, a city which never actually fell to the Russians, suggesting her scuttling may have been premature. Other ships of the Ukrainian Navy probably should have been scuttled and weren't. Of the 8 small gunboats the Ukrainian Navy lost, a majority were in fact captured by Russian and pro-Russian forces intact. And we've got visual evidence to support those claims. The broader point here is that the Ukrainian Navy was obviously outmatched by its Russian opponent. It was more outmatched than the Ukrainian Air Force or the Ukrainian Army. But the bulk of its combat power would be neutralised incredibly quickly, some of it arguably scuttled too quickly, and some of it left to be captured when it could have been scuttled. There may be circumstances unknown to us as observers, but I think for the sake of fairness, if we're going to criticise the Russians for leaving intact equipment to be captured by the Ukrainians, we should call out the fate of the Ukrainian Navy as well. With the Ukrainian Navy essentially neutralised or at least severely curtailed, the Russian Navy had things mostly its own way during the rest of the early war. Odessa would be kept under constant threat, occasionally attacked with missiles, and even, according to some reports, fire from the main gun of the Moskva, something which, if true, would confirm an almost suicidal level of arrogance amongst the Russian Navy for bringing their ships within gun range of the coastline. Meanwhile, trade to Odessa and Ukraine in general by sea was essentially cut. After the famous Snake Island incident and the securing of the island by Russian forces, the Navy plus the ground forces based on Snake Island essentially had a chokehold on maritime trade. This is why you would see growing pressure on the Ukrainian rail system, and also why the international community put such pressure on an agreement to enable grain shipments at the very least to resume. You might remember in the early stages of the war there was serious concern that major buyers of Ukrainian grain, countries in Africa, countries like Egypt, would face incredible inflation in the price of foodstuffs if there couldn't be some agreement to resume the export of Ukraine's tremendous agricultural production. Russia initially looked like it was going to try and use this issue in order to extract concessions on sanctions from the international community. Whatever your views on the morality of that particular move, it was a strategic contribution by the Russian Navy. The Black Sea Fleet now essentially had Ukraine in a maritime chokehold, and with Turkey having closed the straits, there was no real prospect of an intervention by any foreign power. Russia couldn't send new warships through the Dardanelles, but neither could NATO. So while you could argue the Russian Navy overall was probably not doing enough in the war to justify the immense amount of investment and cost that went into maintaining it, particularly the Pacific, the Baltic, and the Northern fleets, overall, the Black Sea Fleet was making a contribution. Essentially unchallenged, they were lords of the Black Sea, or so it seemed. There would be some instances that challenged this perceived superiority and invulnerability, in particular missile attacks by Tochka missiles against ships at port, but overall the story was what it was. Russia was in control. Most of you probably know what happened next, even if we don't know all the details. The moment when Russian naval confidence in the Black Sea would be suddenly shattered. On the 14th of April, the Moskva, the most dangerous surface combatant in the Black Sea, was reported sunk. This was a ship with a crew of more than 400, a vessel with enough firepower to take on US carrier battle groups, a ship with immense symbolic and military value. And now it was at the bottom of the ocean. In terms of military significance, the Moskva was important not just because she was the flagship, but also because she carried the long-range SAM systems protecting most of the Black Sea Fleet. You'll remember that the Slava-class cruisers had a significant complement, 60 or more, of the S-300 long-range anti-aircraft missiles. Now, suddenly, those were gone. I have heard the claim made that this meant that the Black Sea Fleet no longer had anti-aircraft coverage. That's patently wrong. Each of the Admiral Grigorovich-class ships, for example, had 24 SAMs in VLS cells. What they were missing, however, were the long-range variants. The missiles on the Admiral Grigorovich and the lighter ships were adapted from the Buk missile system, which you might remember from the air defense video last week. A capable missile system to be sure, but they lacked the range and engagement distance of the S-300s on the Moskva. In terms of political value, this was the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet. It carried the name of the city of Moscow and reputedly had an Orthodox holy artifact aboard, a piece of the True Cross. So as you can imagine, the media went wild as soon as news of the sinking started to break out. In Russia, there were calls for vengeance. In Ukraine, there was elation, the ship involved in the famous Snake Island incident. The Russian warship that had been told to go F itself had now been converted to a submarine. Given the suddenness and the surprising nature of the sinking, and given how significant it was from a political and military perspective, as you can expect, the hot takes and speculation began almost immediately, with theories ranging from an official Russian story that it was a result of an explosion, a fire, and a storm, to conspiracy theories that Moskva was actually sunk by a British submarine, or according to one particularly outlandish claim that I saw, Special Forces troops from NATO attaching limpet mines to the ship underwater. Now, before I get into the question of what actually resulted in Moskva's sinking, I want to rebut one point that I've seen circling around a lot. And this is the claim that essentially all Russian Navy warships are so old that we shouldn't be surprised if they suddenly explode or sink or whatever, that it's a miracle they're still floating at all and a testament to the quality of Russian technology. That argument is usually used to dismiss any lessons we might take out of the sinking. I just want to make clear, Moskva and the other ships of the Black Sea Fleet are not particularly old, not by the standard of warships. Moskva was commissioned in 1983, but her last refit was in 2020, which was meant to extend her service life out to 2040. Now that might seem old, but warships tend to have some legs on them in terms of service life. USS Nimitz, which is still currently in service and one of the more dangerous warships afloat, was commissioned in 1975. And no one expects her to randomly explode or keel over in a storm. The Admiral Grigorovich-class ships were commissioned, I believe, in 2016, which means they basically still have the shipborne equivalent of new car smell. At that stage of their service life, a ship should be in pretty good nick. You've been commissioned at that point long enough that the crews had a chance to go through shakedown, learn the vessel, get a sense of how to handle her at sea and how to operate her, but at the same time, the vessel hasn't been in service for so long that you start to see components reaching the end of their service life and things start to get more mechanically unreliable. In short, if you assume proper standards of maintenance and upkeep, none of these vessels are so old that they should be running into problems. They should be combat capable. That's not to say they were, and we'll get to that in a moment, just that they should be. So back then to the question of how the Moskva was actually sunk. There's a couple of different versions of events depending on who you choose to listen to. The official Russian version is that the whole thing is a tragic accident. There is an ammunition explosion aboard the ship which causes a fire. Damage control is ultimately unable to contain it, and as a result of a storm, the vessel is eventually evacuated and sinks. The Ukrainian version of events is that Moskva was sunk by 2 Ukrainian Neptune anti-ship missiles that were launched against her. In cooperation, it is claimed, with a single TB2 drone, which was either providing reconnaissance or distracting the Moskva, or both depending on who you choose to listen to. There are also other permutations of this story, people claiming that more than 2 Neptunes were fired, for example, but those are the 2 primary versions of events that made it into media and which have been pushed by the official actors involved. I'll go into a little bit of detail later why I don't find the Russian version particularly compelling, but I thought I'd present both versions here. Now, frankly, neither of those stories should, on paper, be credible. 2 Neptune anti-ship missiles shouldn't be enough to threaten a warship like the Moskva. There are mathematical formulas, salvo formulas, that are designed to calculate how many missiles you realistically need to fire against a warship in order to penetrate its defense screen and score enough hits to reliably sink the thing. 2 Neptunes shouldn't be enough. Moskva has a triple-layered air defense system. It has 6 close-in defense weapon systems for if its missiles fail, and even if the Neptune scores a hit, damage control should be able to keep a warship afloat under most circumstances. And by contrast, the Russian story wherein damage control was so poor the ship sunk, well, it would have to be a heck of an ammunition explosion, far larger than the one we have photographic evidence of, for it to be realistic that the ship should be sunk by the damage. Not to mention the fact that without enemy action, such an ammunition explosion just shouldn't happen. And so to understand a little bit more about what might have happened to Moskva, I turn to extracts from a presentation by Chris Carlson. I've never been a senior naval systems and warfare analyst at the US Defense Intelligence Agency. Chris has. And I'll link a presentation he did on the sinking of the Moskva in the description below. Chris identifies a number of factors that may have contributed to her sinking. The first is the Moskva didn't really edit its patrol pattern very much. It operated in basically the same area of sea zone repeatedly, which probably made locating and engaging her easier. The second element is how incredibly manual a lot of the air defense systems on Moskva were, both her radar and the anti-air systems themselves. I've included images of some of the operator consoles. Chris points out the S-300 was controlled by 3 separate stations, and you have operators tasked with allocating and executing fire. And what that means is the air defense systems on the Moskva, if they were functioning correctly, were hypothetically capable of engaging incoming Neptunes. But that would have been a significant task for the crew that required training and coordination. And remember, a significant portion of Moskva's crew were conscripts. Remember, conscription isn't always very selective, and training sometimes leaves a bit to be desired, so I just want you to imagine how your average friend or colleague or schoolmate might fare if they were faced with that S-300F console and told to make it work. Given how many people I've seen struggle to operate an office printer, I'd really want there to be a pretty exhaustive training regime before I ask them to operate any of those things. And then having got through, there's the issue of damage control, and in particular, the missile placement. In particular, the likely hit location of the incoming Neptune missiles endangers both the forward and aft engine room marked in that diagram on the lower right, and also the ship's so-called post of energy and survivability. This is essentially a nerve center for damage control activities, so it's kind of unfortunate if it's hit by a missile during the initial impact. In the event the PEJ was hit, then there's a greater impetus on the abilities of the crew and officers across the ship to respond on their own initiative and based on their own training. And I'll leave any assumptions we can make about what the standards of training might have been to the audience's imagination. And all of that assumes that the ship's systems are working properly. What if they weren't? And so, of course, minds immediately turn to what was the actual state of the Moskva before she was sunk. For example, there is a document circulating on the internet which is claimed to be a maintenance report for the Moskva before she went into action. And the contents of that document are horrifying. It paints a picture of a ship that was barely functional, a ship that had issues with the fire control radar for the short-range OSA missiles, interference issues with the radar that supported the S-300 so they couldn't turn it on without disrupting their communication system, a ship where, of those 6 close-in defense systems, all but 1 were offline, massive issues with water tightening and damage control practices, doors being left open or poorly maintained, and fear of theft, meaning that a lot of the ship's fire extinguishers and damage control equipment were apparently locked up so the crew wouldn't steal them. All this coupled with allegations that components were well past the end of their planned service life and the ship wasn't capable of performing to her specifications without explicit orders from her commander because that would endanger the survivability of her engines. You put all those claims together and Moskva is, according to that document, basically a sitting duck, with almost none of her integrated air defense system actually working. But the key point here is allegedly. To me, at least, there are elements of that document that read very, very strangely. Plus, it's only circulated on the internet and hasn't been verified. So until I can find someone with experience in the Russian Navy or MOD with experience reading these reports who can confirm that that is how they are written and that is a real report, I'm going to choose to put it to one side. And there are alternative potential explanations beyond just mechanical issues, and mechanical issues may certainly have played a significant part. It may have been a result of distraction, fatigue, many factors which may have diminished the ability of the ship to defend itself to the level that you would expect given her paper specifications. But I'm going to make a potentially unsatisfying claim here and then move on. It doesn't really matter what was wrong with the ship, whether it was the crew, maintenance, inherent system design. There was something wrong. No matter how you spin this, it speaks to the incompetence and arrogance of whoever sent the Moskva into action. If, for example, we assume that all of the systems on the Moskva were in working order, well then the attack shouldn't have worked. A TB2 should have been easily identified and shot down at range, and 2 incoming anti-ship missiles should not have posed a critical threat to the vessel. They should have been easily identified and intercepted. The fact that they weren't suggests critical failures by the Moskva's commander and also the Moskva's crew. Similarly, if the vessel was in good condition, fully watertight with good damage control practices, an explosion followed by a storm also probably shouldn't have sunk the vessel, if for no other reason than the storm that Russia claims sank her doesn't exist in any of the photos of Moskva during her final hours, or in any of the weather data we have for the area where she was located. Meanwhile, if we assume the ship was actually in terrible condition, let's assume that some or all of what is contained in that claimed maintenance report is true. A lot of her air defense systems were offline, her radars had to be turned off in order to allow the communication system to be online, and only one of her Sea Whiz guns was actually working. Let's assume for a moment that version of events is true. Well, in that case, why, dear God, was this ship out there responsible for its own missile and air defense? If the ship couldn't turn on its search or air defense radars, why was it not escorted by some of the Admiral Grigorovich class ships or the other surface combatants that had their own perfectly functional radars and their own air defense systems? Ships in a flotilla are meant to operate as a unit, particularly when it comes to air defense. Ship self-defense is the last layer of that defensive onion. So if Moskva couldn't scan the horizon, she should have been paired with ships that could. If she couldn't engage aerial targets, she should have been paired with ships that could. And if she couldn't engage air targets, what was she doing out there anyway? Her primary purpose by this stage of the war is air defense. In other words, something was horribly wrong here. Whether the ship was functional or not, this is not the sort of attack that should have been capable of sinking her. But sink her it did. So what exactly happened to the Moskva? I don't know. I only know that on paper it shouldn't have happened. Basically, no set of equations you use to support a war game is going to spit out a result that engaging a target like Moskva with 2 Neptune missiles results in a kill. I know that the Russian claim that a storm was critical to the fact the ship was sunk doesn't really track with the weather data, and the claims around an ammunition explosion sinking the vessel at the very least suggests horrible standards of damage control, if indeed that's what happened. And of course, I don't think that was true for reasons we'll go through in a moment, namely that if it was an ammunition explosion, Russian behaviour after the engagement would have been very different. All I can say for certain is that the incident points to Russian warships, particularly the Moskva, having significant issues with survivability in the face of anti-ship missile attack compared to what they should have on paper. And if you wonder why I keep emphasising that I believe it was probably an anti-ship missile attack, let's come back to the question of what the sinking actually meant and how the Russians responded. After the sinking of the Moskva, most operations by the Russian Black Sea Fleet would take place further away from the Ukrainian coast. The basing of the Black Sea Fleet would be largely relocated to Russia proper, and the zone of operations would move outside of ASM range of the Ukrainian coastline. We also got visual evidence of more and more cases of smaller Russian vessels travelling around with ground-based air defense systems, like Tor, strapped to the back of the ship. Now, I often apply the maxim, if you're trying to measure the truth of a situation, look at how the actors involved respond and act. If Moskva had been sunk by poor ammunition handling and damage control standards and by a freak storm, the expected result would have been something like immediate crushing drills across the Black Sea Fleet and inspections to make sure that whatever caused the first ammunition explosion didn't repeat itself, and then once they were confident, you would expect the fleet to largely go back to business as usual. The solution to poor ammunition storage standards or to poor handling conditions of a vessel in a storm is not normally to strap more missiles to the back of a ship. Instead, the integration of additional air defense capabilities and the movement of most of the fleet outside of anti-ship missile range suggests that the threat that the Russians were defending against was probably anti-ship missiles and possibly airborne threats. It's thus the Russian response which makes me reasonably confident that this was caused by a Ukrainian anti-ship missile, because everything they've done since the sinking suggests that they're very scared of anti-ship missiles. And thus I'd conclude the sinking meant three things, beyond the political factors and all of that. Militarily, it meant the Black Sea Fleet had diminished long-range air defense capability. It meant that there was reason to believe that Russian warships were more vulnerable to ASM attack than we otherwise thought, and that in the future, Ukraine could be confident that the Russian Navy would operate more conservatively, something which would take a small amount of pressure off the Ukrainians and their coastline. And so while I'll concede we are still not absolutely certain that ASMs were involved in the sinking of the Moskva, it's a good opportunity to pivot to the discussion of new and emerging threats, things that have been identified as dangers to warships specifically in the Ukrainian conflict, and also more broadly as a result of the sinking of the Moskva and other incidents that we've seen in Ukraine. And the first threat, obviously, is the one we've just talked about. Anti-ship missiles. This is a threat that has long been understood because this was the quintessential Cold War problem. Western forces preparing themselves to defend against massed attacks by anti-ship missiles from Soviet warships. While Soviet warships had to defend themselves against the torpedoes of US submarines, but also missiles launched from US naval aviation. And when we're talking about ground-based versions of these anti-ship missiles in particular, there are reasons that they're dangerous opponents for warships. The first is they're cheap, or at least they're cheap compared to a warship, when something like a carrier can go for north of $10 billion US, having a couple of anti-ship missiles based along coastlines, something like the Bastion system produced by the Russians, is a great asymmetric response if you can lure the vessel in range. In that case, a carrier is probably a bad example. But if you have an opponent who you know is going to have to bring expensive vessels in close to the coastline, say for example, someone who is going to try and conduct an amphibious landing, then in terms of cheap counters, ground-based anti-ship missiles are promising. These missiles can also be quite mobile. Neptune fits on a truck chassis, Harpoon's even lighter and can be even more mobile. Even the heavy supersonic missiles of the Bastion system, again, that's a heavy truck chassis that can be moved by road. You can hide these things in forests, mountains, and camouflage positions, and fire whenever a ship comes within range. In other words, they're concealable. You can hide them. You can hide them a lot more easily than you can hide a large warship on the ocean. It's kind of hard to hide surface warships. And finally, these systems, especially modern ones, are very capable of networking. What do I mean by that? They don't need their own sensors to identify and engage a particular target. The Neptune missile, for example, isn't going to use its own onboard radar for most of the journey, only really for the last stage of its guidance. It's going to get to the target based on information that's been provided by other platforms. Maybe a drone, maybe a radar, maybe a ship, maybe even a satellite, depending on how the communication system and the kill chain is set up. And that means you don't give the location of the missile systems away by having to co-locate a massively powerful radar system that's blaring across the electromagnetic spectrum right next to the missiles. We've also seen some limited use of ballistic missiles as opposed to traditional anti-ship missiles in the Ukrainian-Russian war so far. A traditional anti-ship missile will skim along the ocean and hit a warship. Ballistic missile is a ballistic missile. It flies in a high arc and then comes plunging down. That might be interesting for anyone who's been following the development of China's anti-ship ballistic missiles. But I'll note that the targets in this case were ships that were in port, not moving, and the weapon system wasn't really designed for the task, so I'd be cautious about drawing too many lessons there. The air threat to warships is also not a particularly new one. This is in fact a tale as old as time, or at the very least as old as the Second World War in earnest. A number of smaller Russian patrol boats have been engaged and damaged by TB2 drones. The TB2 was likewise allegedly involved in the sinking of the Moskva, although its exact role is hard to establish. Whether it was reconnaissance, surveillance, distraction, or whether the drone was even there is yet to be confirmed. The threat posed by drones to warships is not a particularly new one. They are a particular species of air threat, but warships have generally been considering how to engage these smaller, cheaper, swarming targets, things like drones or cruise missiles, for some time, so I don't expect their entry to be particularly disruptive on the naval battlefield. Although we will talk about some of the adaptations that are going into preparing to defend against them a little bit later. The role of reconnaissance drones, large reconnaissance drones in this conflict, is also notable. NATO, for example, often has Global Hawk surveillance drones circling the Black Sea, call sign Forte. Now, these have presumably been quite effective. There's every reason to believe they'd be quite effective in tracking Russian surface warships. But one of the reasons they're so effective, I would suggest, is because the Russians aren't allowed to shoot them down. They're not at war with the United States, and shooting down United States Air Force assets would be a quick way to change that. In the event of an actual war, I suspect that Forte would have been one of the first targets for long-range Russian air defences. More interesting to me is the potential of networked intelligence systems informing viable kill chains. That is, how do you network multiple sources of information, satellites, drones, intelligence, to get you from the point where you find something that you would like to engage to the point where you can task a weapon system, like an anti-ship missile, to target it and put it at the bottom of the ocean, assess whether it is at the bottom of the ocean after you engage it, and whether you need to fire again. The ocean is, and I know this is shocking to many people, a very big place. So finding something that is moving on the ocean, locating it accurately, and then being able to coordinate a strike is sometimes difficult. As more information becomes available, it'll be very interesting to understand how Ukraine operated its kill chain. How did it find the target? How did it task an engagement to the target using those Neptune missiles? How did it assess the hits, and how did it make the decision whether to re-engage or not? There's a lot of hypothetically very dangerous weapon systems out there on the market. DF-21D is a great example. That's China's famous carrier-killer ballistic missile. But the key weakness of those systems, or the question mark, I should say, over those systems, is how viable it is to form a successful kill chain, to locate a target, to provide targeting information, to coordinate and action a strike on the target that actually causes major damage. And I expect observers of the Ukrainian war are going to be watching very closely and finding out what information they can and converting that into lessons learned. But that's enough about what we've discovered about the war so far and the sinking of the Moskva. Let's talk a little bit more about what might happen next. The first point here is that Russia does appear to have adopted a largely standoff role for the Navy. There are fewer and fewer reports of Russian ships moving in close towards the Ukrainian coastline, and many more ships are based in Russia proper as opposed to Crimea than were the case when the war began. The emphasis now seems to be on using these ships as long-range missile attack platforms once again, which is also how they were used in the opening hours anyway and how they were deployed in Syria. With more and more Western anti-ship missiles arriving to supplement whatever stocks of Neptune the Ukrainians have, I don't expect this behaviour will change anytime soon unless the Russians are confident they've solved their defensive issues. I also expect we'll see the introduction of more unmanned systems to the naval war, particularly on the Ukrainian side, and I judge this based only on the disclosed weapon supplies going from Western countries to Ukraine. The USA, for example, has disclosed that it's going to be providing a number of, quote, unmanned coastal defence vessels to Ukraine. And German disclosed military aid includes an item for at least 10 unmanned surface vessels of non-specified type. The Netherlands has provided some mine-clearing drones, and there's a variety of small manned boats as well. All of this suggests that Ukraine is not focusing on, for example, trying to put large ships into the water to push the Russian Navy off. It's going to rely on small boats and unmanned systems in conjunction with the other major threat, missile systems. A number of Western countries have pledged Harpoon to Ukraine, Harpoon being the primary Western anti-ship missile, which is usually fired from warships or aircraft, but in Ukraine, they're using ground-based launchers. Now, this is obviously very helpful to Ukraine because we don't know what their production capability or their stockage levels are for their Neptune anti-ship missiles, their domestic ASM arsenal. But in some ways, I think it also brings home a sort of gap in Western arsenals, that Harpoon is the best ground-based system that can be offered in quantity. Harpoon is what there is, but when you compare Harpoon to, for example, the Onyx missiles fired by the Russians, it's slow, it's short range, it has a much smaller warhead, it's just generally a lighter, less dangerous missile than what Russia is able to field. And in part, this is simply a doctrinal issue, just as when you deal with air defences. NATO countries have powerful air forces, powerful naval air forces, and powerful submarine groups. It's generally assumed that they're the ones that will do the sinking of the enemy warships, so they don't need coastal defence missiles in large numbers, or at least most NATO powers don't. Now, that may be an entirely reasonable assumption, but it's an interesting observation nonetheless. In any case, we should expect that the closer you get to the Ukrainian coastline, particularly once you get within Harpoon range, will basically be a no-go zone for Russian vessels, because there could always be a concealed ground-based launcher capable of engaging and sinking you. All of this makes Crimea even more of a linchpin than it already is. Politically, Crimea is obviously extremely important to both sides, which is why the peninsula comes up so often in talks of potential Russian escalation. But for the Russian Navy, Crimea is also vital, because if you look at a map there, if you presume that the Russian Navy cannot operate within anti-ship missile range of any Ukrainian coastline, then if the Crimean Peninsula were to be held by Ukraine, then a much larger portion of the Black Sea is suddenly in range of long-range ASMs or even short-range ASMs like Harpoon. Couple this with the prospect of Ukraine potentially stationing air defense systems in Crimea, and suddenly more of the Black Sea can be dominated by Ukrainian SAM coverage as well. Obviously, the war is not going to be decided by the naval dimension, and Crimea was going to be important regardless. And the final point I want to raise on the question of what next is the question of Russian force regeneration. Because I stand by the idea that one of the worst mistakes that analysts can make is assuming that tomorrow is guaranteed to be the same as today and that patterns continue forever. This conflict has featured multiple inflection points in terms of capability. Both forces have tried to adapt, albeit at different speeds. I'd argue the Ukrainians have generally been quicker to adapt to changing circumstances than the Russians, but both sides have adapted when they face challenges. Russia is now keenly publicly aware of its navy's weakness in the Black Sea. Even if we can't be sure, the admirals in Russia probably know why Moskva sunk. And it's their understanding of the situation which has caused the Russian Navy to be more conservative and to be more careful, which suggests that maybe other ships suffer some of the same weaknesses and vulnerabilities. Any good force will be looking at those problems, those issues, those errors, and trying to remedy them. If systems are offline, then there should be crash repair programs. If training was deficient and damage control practices were poor, well then remedial training should be ordered across the fleet. The question I would thus ask is, how effective is Russia likely to be in resolving whatever problems it faces, be they technical or in terms of training and practice? They may not be able or willing to resolve any of them, or they may be able to overhaul their capabilities and come back all the stronger, albeit down one slava. My point is, when predicting the future, don't presume that either the Ukrainians or the Russians are going to stand still. After all, if you assume that patterns continued forever, then on the 25th of February you'd be predicting the fall of Ukraine itself within days or weeks, and if you extrapolated based on, say, the second day of the Kharkiv breakthrough, well, the Ukrainians would be in Moscow by now. When analysing a situation, remember that people, react. And with that said, I thought I'd close out with some lessons and observations based on what we've seen in the naval war so far. I don't think it would be one of my videos if I didn't. The first, surprise, surprise, is the absolute importance of readiness and upkeep when you're talking about naval ships and systems. A ship's systems don't do it any good if they don't work. It doesn't matter if your power plant is rated to push a ship to 35 knots. If it hasn't been maintained, it's only safely rated to do 8. The best high-performance surface-to-air missiles in the world don't matter a jot if you can't turn on the bloody fire control radar. And this, I think, is a dangerous problem that most navies have encountered to a greater or lesser degree. A fleet, when pushed, can maintain hulls at sea, generally keep ships sailing around doing their thing, not sinking, without necessarily showing off a deep decay in readiness levels. Just because a ship can float, sail from point A to point B, and generally looks okay from the outside at the point of inspection, doesn't mean the crew is sharp, doesn't mean the crew is motivated, doesn't mean the systems are reliable, heck, doesn't mean the systems even work. We watched the Russian Navy operate in Syria, firing cruise missiles and the like, but it didn't demonstrate to most commentators the depths of the readiness issues that we might be dealing with when we talk about the Russian Navy. And so I think the questions for other powers is going to be looking at their own Navy. Are there scandals in maintenance? Are there decisions that have been made on sustainment that weaken the capability of the vessels that are in service? Do we actually have ships that can perform to their specifications? Or have they been worn down by issues with readiness and upkeep? Because whatever the precise cause, the sinking of the Moskva demonstrated that you can have a big difference between your on-paper and your actual capabilities. Moskva had a multi-layered air defense system that should have been fine until it wasn't. And so I think other powers need to inventory and understand any gap that exists in their capabilities between what they think they're capable of doing or what they feel they should be capable of doing and what they can actually do. And realistically, one of the best ways to determine that is to actually test those capabilities. If your fleet has an air defense system that's meant to be able to engage X dozen incoming air threats at any given time, well, it's probably time for a snap exercise to test whether the crew is actually capable of doing so. Maybe you don't warn them about the exercise. Maybe you don't let them rest up beforehand. Maybe you have an honest test of whether or not the operational tempo that the ships have been going through and the maintenance schedule that they may have skipped means the ship or the crew is not capable of performing to specifications, or maybe they are. You can understand in any organisation that leaders might not want to report that there are issues with the area of the business, or in this case, the ship or the unit that they are responsible for. That's dangerous, because identifying the actual state of forces, the actual capability of systems, and the actual readiness of crews, well, that matters. Because if you think you can stop 11 incoming anti-ship missiles, and even if one hits, you can keep the ship afloat, and it turns out you can't stop 2 and you can't stop the ship sinking afterwards, well, then a lot of people might lose their lives. That's the harrowing nature of potential combat operations. Bullshit that protects reputations during peacetime can cost lives during wartime. And I've implied it, but let's talk about it explicitly. This is not just about the maintenance and upkeep of individual systems. It's not just about whether a radar system works or whether a missile performs to specifications. It's about all the soft factors that go into how effective a naval warship is. These are factors that are sometimes hard to capture in the most simplistic models of naval engagements, the kind of which you'll see in, for example, a video game. Things that focus on salvo size, how much ordnance is in the air, the technical performance of systems, and how many of those are likely to be intercepted, how many hit points, for want of a better word, a ship has. What we're talking about instead are the capabilities and competence of the crew on that ship. The big one is obviously damage control. How capable are your crew of responding to unfortunate or unexpected events, like, for example, there being a giant hole in the side of the ship or something being on fire? You don't really want to learn firefighting drill when something is burning. You don't want someone to crush you with ammunition handling standards and safety briefings when something has already flashed. Exercising and practicing proper ammunition storage and proper damage control training and firefighting training and exercises, these are things that can tire and wear down crews, but they're skills that are essential to the survivability of a ship in the event that it's hit. And then beyond that, there are all the other points around crew alertness, communication, response times. How effectively do the crew operate as a unit? This isn't World of Warships. You can't steer the ship using one person using a keyboard and mouse. It's a complex system of hundreds of individuals working together in order to make that system function the way it's intended to. What brings this point home for me is that one of the theories around how the Moskva was sunk was the idea that the TB2 drone that was allegedly involved distracted the air defense and bridge crew from the incoming missiles. Now, any active duty Navy out there should feel free to correct me, but my understanding is that just shouldn't happen. You shouldn't have a situation where you have one airborne threat which commands the attention of the entire bridge crew and everyone operating the air defense systems and the search radars. People should always be scanning for additional incoming tracks and threats. So if there's any truth to that claim at all, it points to a failure of these soft factors of training and good practice. A number of the crew on the Moskva were conscripts, and perhaps there's room to reconsider whether using conscripts on a vessel like this one is really a good idea, at least in certain roles. And then finally, in terms of soft factors, I'd point to the issue of coordination with other services. Not just in terms of the Russian Navy being able to engage targets identified by the Russian army, which is sometimes described by some Russian observers as a complicated process, but also things like coverage. If Moskva was going into a danger zone, why didn't she have cover from the Air Force? Why weren't ground-based air defense systems augmenting her safety if she was within range of them? To get the most out of a ship, the crew needs to be good at doing their jobs, and then the ship needs to know how to operate as part of a team, and that team needs to operate alongside other services. That sort of training, that sort of practice, that sort of culture is expensive. It's a lot of training time and it's hard to build. You can imagine that when people are writing the budgets, it would be attractive to cut down the funding allocated to those things so you can get more hulls into the water, get more ships, increase the ostensible strength of the fleet. But if you don't invest in capability, in these soft factors, then the Navy's not going to do the job that it's capable of doing. And so a balance is always going to have to be struck when you're making difficult budgeting decisions. Russia, for its part, seems to have focused on hull count, building its new doomsday weapons, its underwater nuclear torpedoes, and its next-generation submarines. We haven't seen as much evidence of an intensive training regime or a performance culture. The missile threat and the drone threat are probably also going to get a bunch of attention. The Moskva sits alongside the General Belgrano, which was sunk during the Falklands War, as one of the largest surface combatants sunk since the end of the Second World War. And it's claimed she was sunk by a relatively small number of shore-based anti-ship missiles. Given that that has subsequently forced Russian warships to operate further away from Ukraine, a number of observers are probably going to be looking at that and saying that this is a vindication of the idea that anti-ship missiles can operate in an area denial role. That is, anti-ship missiles' mere existence can basically allow you to designate a part of the ocean and say, your warships don't go here because, they might get blown up. And one might expect that means that any nation which faces an opponent with a stronger navy that might want to bring its navy close to its shoreline, perhaps to bombard it or launch attacks or even land troops in a potential amphibious invasion, will be looking at whether or not they can build up their stocks of shore-based anti-ship missiles to duplicate this kind of threat. Although again, I would note we should be a little bit careful. On paper, Moskva shouldn't have been sunk by the things that it is claimed sunk her. Not that that is stopping other navies from looking into potential counters to make this problem go away, or at least be mitigated. The US, for example, is already out there saying they're accelerating work on directed energy weapons, lasers basically, and electronic warfare systems to help augment the defensive capabilities of their ships. A lot of upcoming US warships are horribly over-designed when it comes to their electrical generation capacity. That is, they can produce a heck of a lot more power than they actually need to operate. And that's basically so they have the juice necessary to operate these laser and jamming systems when they're eventually fitted. Using a laser gives you a low-cost, rapidly repeatable method of engaging incoming that's cheaper and more efficient than firing, for example, a multi-million-dollar interceptor rocket at it. I think we can expect other navies to consider doing the same. The final point, and it may just be because I've been influenced by too many bubbleheads, but I'd like to point out that it does seem that there's nowhere to hide on the modern oceanic battlefield, at least in a contained environment like the Black Sea. In a universe where even private companies can sell high-definition satellite footage and regular citizens can pay to task those satellites, it's very hard to hide 9,000, 10,000 or 100,000 tons of metal at sea. Forte may be the example for this war in particular, a constant source of concern for the Russian Navy, but if not Forte, it would have been something else. There are still going to be challenges for countries in terms of producing a kill chain based off that information, refining down the exact location of a ship and turning that into a solution to actually engage it. There's a big gap between knowing the fleet is roughly over there, headed in roughly that direction as of 20 or 30 minutes ago, and knowing exactly how to hit it. But that first part, knowing roughly where the fleet is getting easier and easier. If you want to have a surface navy and keep it safe, well then planners are probably going to have to proceed with that understanding in mind. So in conclusion, the Russian Navy greatly outmatched the Ukrainian Navy on paper at the beginning of the war, and in the early stages of the war it basically had everything its own way. The Black Sea Fleet either captured the Ukrainian Navy or, more often, the Ukrainian Navy scuttled itself in order to avoid being captured or engaging its opponent. In the early days and weeks, the Black Sea Fleet was actually quite aggressive in some of its operations and also postured for potential naval landings, something which forced the Ukrainians to locate defensive forces at Odessa just to protect against that possibility. Since the sinking of the Moskva, though, things have changed. The reasons for the sinking are uncertain. I've gone through some of the theories and why I would believe some or reject others as more or less likely, but the ultimate implications of that sinking are more clear. The Russian Navy now plays a much more passive role in the conflict, and the reason it does so is because of the ongoing potential threat of things like anti-ship missiles, or at least that is what I think it is reasonable to conclude. Out of this, we can draw lessons for other powers. The threat posed by anti-ship missiles, the development of technology and the impetus there, but also the need for a renewed focus on training, maintenance, readiness to make sure that ships and their systems and their crews can perform to their paper capability standard when they're called upon during wartime. Moskva should not have been sunk by the attack that sunk her, and the fact she was suggests a failure of one or more of these points. For those navies that watched that sinking closely, I doubt that any would want to repeat the experience. Alright, channel update to close out. First thing, massive thank you to everyone who's joined the Patreon over the last couple of weeks. There's a big backlog of messages there that I've been working through. Hopefully by the time this video goes live, I've responded to most of them. If not, I will get to them soon. The support I've gotten there has given me a little bit of freedom so I can focus more on the channel, so I do appreciate it. Now, next week's topic really does depend on a couple of things we're waiting on in terms of developments at the front in Ukraine. In the event that we're still waiting for certain developments to occur, then there's a number of topics that are well overdue. For example, the European defence sector or the eastern flank of NATO are topics that I've wanted to cover for a while, so we'll see how things go. I'm also testing logistics around bringing a few other guest contributors on board. Stay tuned on that one. Nothing's set in stone yet, but I'll announce things in the coming weeks if things are locked down. Finally, a note for anyone that's interested that I am playing Terra Invicta over on my gaming channel during my rather limited supply of free time, so if you're interested, feel free to check it out. But more than anything, a giant thank you to, well, all of you for continuing to engage with this content, to be as supportive as you have. The enthusiasm and the civility of the comment section on these videos is something special, and I genuinely appreciate it. So thank you very much to all of you, and I'll see you again next week.